Hello and welcome to the Social World Podcast. I'm Dave Niven, and today I'm going to do something I hope just a little bit different and interesting, and that is I'm going to present the program as a magazine with several different items in it and see how you like that, because I do want to hear from you again afterwards. Either use SpeakPipe, which is on the website, which is just a one-click way of recording your thoughts, and for future ideas as well, or emails are there, or whatever. Just let me know what you think of the format. Now today I want to talk about three different specific things. A couple of interviews that I've done with the BBC reflect some fascinating subjects that are on the ground at the moment. The first is that in social care, and it's about its urgent need for funding. Now, the government's allowing some council tax to be ring-fenced, we've heard that, but the Local Government Association and others are saying that's absolutely inadequate even then, and what it still will not prevent doing is most councils actually still making cuts in essential services. So we've got a real dilemma here. Is it enough? What should happen? And what should happen to support the most vulnerable in society? Whether it's the frail elderly or those that need 24-hour care. What funding can we find to satisfy the very basic needs for care of this huge and growing group within society? Now, the second interview reflects the dilemma of finding out that perhaps a member of staff has participated in some inappropriate activity, not enough to make it a criminal offence, but enough to worry others as to their behaviour and how you actually go about that. And the story was about the council in North Somerset, at which a particular member of staff was found to have some fairly inappropriate messages on their Facebook page concerning teenage girls. So we'll have a look at that and a listen to that. But the third and possibly the main discussion point today is something that I haven't done anything about before, which essentially is reflect a bit about the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse that's going on now under the chairwomanship of Professor Alexis Jay. We all may remember that she's, of course, the fourth chair in place since the inception of this inquiry, and it did look pretty chaotic for a while. However, I attended a conference day in Manchester just last week, at which she and her team were present and made presentations, and I must admit that I'm a bit more reassured after that the actual inquiry itself is back on track. I hope it's not going to be as long in reporting as Chilcot was for the Iraq War, and I believe that there are going to be, in April 2018, there's going to be an interim report issued with recommendations then. So essentially there will be some come out before the final end of the inquiry itself. So this is fascinating, and I'm going to talk about the different parts of it, the different bits of it, and how you can keep in touch with it. So I've quite an agenda, but at the same time I think quite interesting to do a magazine programme. So, as I said, the first issue was to do with the social care and our vulnerable elderly and our vulnerable others within society who need our total care and far, far more funding than we seem to be making available at the moment.
Well, David Niven, as I said, is here this morning. A great name, by the way, David.
It just shows you're over 25.
Yeah, it does show I'm over 26. So, David, tell me, the crisis in social care is not really a surprise, is it? Could councils have prepared for this better?
I'm not sure about that question, because obviously they've been trying to struggle with all the various austerity measures that have been demanded of them as well. It's not just obviously health, but this particular one focuses on that. What I would say, though, is that it's unfortunate because the most vulnerable people in society often are the poorest as well. And they often live in areas where there is a much reduced council tax. Some of the the northern authorities, for example, where the actual amount of money that the authorities take in is far less because the council tax is smaller for them, and therefore it's a double whammy, if you see what I mean. It's the most vulnerable getting punished in the most vulnerable areas. So, I mean, there's that. But also, we do hope, don't we, that the people who enticed us to vote for Brexit weren't lying to us, because one of the promises that millions of people decided to vote for Brexit on was £350 million a week, because that's what we pay the European Union, and that would go straight into the National Health Service. I remember that vividly as a promise, and you know, everybody was quite excited about that because it certainly felt that that would sweep away an awful lot of the problems. And if you couple that with the fact that we're sort of 13th out of the top 15 European countries in terms of the amount of spend that we have on health and social care, I mean, we're way back in the first place anyway. So it's a whole combination of things that is going to make big problems for the National Health Service.
And do you think it is the attitude of the National Health Service now that much of the care is handed on to social workers now? It's handed on to the social care of councils now?
Oh, of course, yes, because, I mean, they're dedicated to protect the most vulnerable, and the rising elderly population and the rising elderly frail population, because of obviously people living much longer, etc., and being maintained much longer because of the better health care that can be available to them. I mean, yes, I mean, because that just means that the caseloads of social workers working in that particular area are growing, and the amount of money to pay social workers to get any extra in to actually do it is disappearing. And so the maths are there. It's really unfortunate that the priorities of this government don't seem to be heading towards those of our most vulnerable citizens.
But in your view, is it a case of sort of kicking this problem into the long grass and pushing people who need care onto different agencies and nobody really taking full responsibility for it?
Exactly, and many, I mean, I think the King's Fund, who are a very reputable kind of research organisation, did a study last year to show just how far behind much of Europe we are already, sorry, using Europe again, but, you know, just as a comparator to us. And so, in effect, you know, I don't think there's a central plan here. Unfortunately, I think we're just chipping away at the edges, or whatever the analogy is, you know, just trying to sort of stem the tide until such time there's going to be a real crisis, and effectively sort of huge money is going to have to be found from elsewhere, and of course elsewhere is therefore going to suffer. Planning, you need much more better planning and much recognition of the kind of geographical problems in this country.
I mean, well, what is the answer here, David? Because, you know, for a start, anyone with a house who needs social care or to go into care has to sell the house, or that's now been, I don't know what's happening with that now. Nobody seems to know whether it's been overturned or not, because I know people are still having to sell their houses to look after their elderly. But that was seen as unfair because there were people who don't have a house, who don't have to pay anything towards their social care. So all of these things, what is the answer?
Root and branch. A complete. You know how at the moment we're having you have these major inquiries, whether it's Chilcot looking into Iraq, or whether it's Alexis Jay looking into child sexual exploitation and so forth. Massive inquiries. I really do think we need something that churns this whole problem around and comes up with some imagination. I mean, steal from the neighbours, steal from other countries. Look at the way that they do it. Look at how they actually target and prioritise money much earlier on for social care. I mean, it just beggars belief that this isn't recognised as a serious enough problem, so that we're all arguing over sort of virtual pennies when it comes to actually asking local authorities to rob Peter to pay Paul.
But you've got to wonder: is it just because it's social care is just not very sexy? It's just not. It doesn't get the, you know, all the politicians excited. Why is it that it's ignored?
I think because I mean, there's probably lots of answers to it, but the first one that sprung to mind when you asked the question there was Well, it's one of these long-term, you don't see it right in front of your face, creeping problems. You know, it's a bit like asking 25-year-olds why they haven't really seriously started a pension.
Yeah.
It's that kind of feeling to it, I think.
There's a sense that none of us think we're going to end up there.
Yeah, exactly. And those of us that recognise we are still a bit bereft of ideas, because what we've got to draw on in terms of actual the materials to construct something are pretty thin.
It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? Is money going to fix it?
Not entirely, but it certainly would help. You know, I mean, it's the old story. Of course, it would help, but as long it's got to be spent properly. I mean, you can't just chuck money at it and ask people who've got no idea to construct something. What you need to do is get a hold of some people with imagination and experience, and actually then construct something that lasts for 20 years, as opposed to sort of year on year on year.
Does it frustrate you looking at the situation of social care? I mean, last week on this programme we were talking about elderly people who are not even having their basic needs met. They've been forced into this sort of care in the community, if you like, and nobody's even going in to feed them.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, one way people tried to think, oh, well, look, this is how we can best spread our resources, is by being absolutely clock watchers, you know, this 20-minute per visit thing or whatever. And all the various agencies that are being kind of brought in from the private sector to actually supplement, you know, care, domiciliary care, etc. Obviously, have got to make a profit, because that's their whole raison d'etre. And so at the end of the day, they're still stuck in that problem. And let's not remember, it's not just the elderly we're talking about here. I mean, there's something like, 250,000 young carers missing out on their childhood up and down this country, because they're having to look after dependent relatives on top of actually trying to do school or whatever else. And they're often the unsung heroes and heroines of the community.
It's an extraordinary ongoing issue, isn't it? David, just before I let you go, were your parents fans?
Were my parents, pardon?
Fans of David Niven?
Well, no, I mean, I'll tell you that my first given name is Robert David.
Oh.
No, but ever since the age of dot, my father in the war was Graham. But everybody called him David because, like, he was the big film star at the time.
Oh, of course. So it was his nickname.
So David, you know, it was almost one of these inevitable tags. I don't mind now, because it's only, as I said, people over 25 that seem to
Well, I think it's brilliant. It's a brilliant name. Thank you very much indeed there. David Niven, former chair of the British Association of Social Workers.
All right, so we're into the second interview now, which is about finding out that a member of staff has behaved in an inappropriate way, the dilemma of dealing with that, how one authority, North Somerset in this case, did, and what people are talking about. So let's have a listen to this.
Let's talk to David Niven, who's an expert in child protection. David, good morning.
Oh, hello, Emma. Yeah.
Let's start with Matthew Hill's final point there. When something on Facebook isn't criminal but is inappropriate, how should a public organisation handle it, like the police and indeed in this case North Somerset Council?
Well, my first reaction would be that the person, if they were the ones who actually posted it, and we've got to remember that, because social media can sometimes be a very porous medium, and other people can do things. But if the person admitted that it was them that actually posted whatever it was, or it became evident that it was, then my personal view would be that they should be suspended until such time as the investigations were complete and the interviews had been taken place with the person to actually try and determine whether or not, this was their particular points of view, and this is how they looked at the world, and this is how they looked at children, because essentially, for me, that does represent danger.
Mr. Jellings denies any wrongdoing and hasn't been convicted of an offence, but given what the Inside Out programme has uncovered, would you expect him to now be working for an organisation like the National Health Service?
I mean, again, it depends on what access he had and what people he was working with. But let me make this point. You know, when people do enhanced checks on people before they are given, they come into positions, and what's called an enhanced check takes place. That now looks at, or has done for years, what would be considered to be sort of what they call soft intelligence in the police, such as, whether or not people have actually said or done things in the past, or not being convicted, but being kind of accused of something that might well be considered to be inappropriate or dangerous. And that does count against them. It used to be things that were considered in the back rooms of police stations, on colour-coded card indexes, suspicions about people, because that's now what's taken into consideration when you're looking for people who are going to be employed, contact with or working with children or vulnerable adults. So to my mind, it comes into that same purview. And look at the day we're talking on when the new National Cybercrime Intelligence Unit is actually taking over and beginning to protect us against that, because cybercrime and sexual exploitation of children online is an enormous problem in this country and all over Europe and the world, the whole world, to be quite frank with you. And therefore, anybody who demonstrates a proclivity towards kind of, if you like, towards actually sort of saying things about children in a horrible, violent way, in my view, has absolutely no place in an organisation that is committed to protecting children.
It also raises an issue for everyone, doesn't it? In that, I work for the BBC and have done for nearly 10 years. And the way I conduct myself, even when I am not at work, is subject to scrutiny. So, I have to conduct myself in an appropriate way. And it's no good me saying, well, it's my own Facebook page or it's my own Twitter account. I conduct myself in that way. And I suppose there is a question around employers and employees about the way people conduct themselves out of work, or are we treading into privacy territory there?
Well, my own personal view is that there should be a certain amount of access allowed to people who are under suspicion of any kind of offences or any kind of impropriety against children. For example, and I think people should. Do you remember the baby P case, Peter Connolly, the baby that died? Mm-hmm. The mother who actually was convicted in the end always swore blind that she never had a boyfriend in the house, he wasn't bad, blah, blah, blah. Yet the day before the baby died, she posted on Facebook all sorts of sort of sex, drugs and rock and roll, laugh, 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 all about her new fella who lived with her. And only if people had actually looked at her Facebook page, you never just know quite what the future would have been. And I do think that people now should, privatise their own Facebook accounts. Ordinary families should, because that's where a lot of paedophiles and other sex offenders actually get material from. But at the same time, I do believe that the authorities now should have a right to examine people's social media, but actually just to as part of investigations, to actually just see who is a threat out there in the community.
Interesting to get your views, David. Thank you. David Niven, child protection expert there. David used to be former chair of the British Association of Social Workers.
Right then. Well, we have their moral, criminal, ethical issues, and there'll constantly be questions like that being asked about those that we allow to be part of the safeguarding landscape. Right, so what I'd like to do now is actually introduce a subject to the podcast that we haven't really talked about before. I'm hoping too that we can get some interviews with the people involved in this as time goes by, and that's the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Now, this conference that I went to about it took place last week in Manchester, and the people involved were Professor Alexis Jay, who's leading the inquiry, and her core team, who were present as well, explaining the three different particular core issues of the inquiry. The issues, projects, they've got three. Now, the first one is what they call the Truth Project. Now, the actual inquiry was set up to look at the ways that organisations in England and Wales may have failed to protect children from sexual abuse in the past. And so they felt that they needed something innovative and attractive enough to survivors and victims of abuse who may well not have wanted to give public testimony, but still wanted to talk about what happened to them. And so this Truth Project was set up as a way of listening to people who were sexually abused as children in order to understand what happened in the past and what organisations that they were involved with at the time, was how they responded, so that we can learn lessons for the future. So I think it's a very good thing, this Truth Project. And so it gives them an opportunity to share their views, and it's confidential. And that is the crux. So all support is available, both pre the interview, if you like, and after the interview as well, in terms of counselling, support, and just general kind of arm round the shoulders, as well as kind of any issues that have been brought up. The only caveat that they have is that if a disclosure is made that concerns a child who's still alive and being cared for, obviously they have to notify the authorities immediately to look into that. So that's the basic kind of thing about the Truth Project. And the second one, and the second project, the core projects, if you like, that the inquiry is looking into, is called the Public Hearings Project. And that essentially will look like a conventional inquiry with panels and boards and so forth, where witnesses come forward, they're asked questions, they give evidence, and it's on oath, and they are subject to cross-examination, because this essentially is an inquiry with teeth that can not only compel people to come and give evidence, but will have a great deal of weight in any pronouncements that come after that. Now, just going into this in a bit more detail, the actual inquiry itself will have the chair, as I mentioned, Professor Alexis Jay, and a 3-strong panel that will be assisting her. But it's also supported by a victim and survivors consultative panel, in which I think it's about 7 people who all are victims and survivors of abuse, have come together and will give independent advice. They are not compelled to do anything except for say what they think and say what they see. And I think that's a very refreshing attitude to take. Now, generally speaking, the inquiry will have 4, as it says, I'm reading now really, 4 thematic strands that are the focus of their work. The first is cultural, looking at the attitudes and behaviours and the values within institutions that prevent us from stopping child sexual abuse. They'll look at the structural side of things, therefore the legislation, the governance and the organisational frameworks between institutions. They'll look at the financial side, the funding and resource arrangements for relevant institutions and services. And finally, they'll look at the professional and the political, focusing on the leadership, professional practice issues for all of those who actually work or volunteer in these relevant institutions. And there are many institutions who will be under the microscope for this inquiry, ranging from charities who have or who had residential responsibilities for children and young people, various church organisations from the big to the small, local authorities, providers of care, and many others, including, interestingly enough, all the inspection organisations that have as part of their remit to actually look into child sexual abuse. And so effectively we're going to have a particularly wide landscape, and therefore it will take quite some time. And as I said in the introduction, I think that the preliminary recommendations coming out in about April 2018 will be welcome, because otherwise it could just drag on for years and years and years, and finally people might forget what the whole thing was about in the first place. Now, the third particular core project that's taking place is that of a research project, and that has got particular challenges to it, but at the same time they've given themselves a very challenging remit, in that they will get the best that exists, they will dig down until they do, they will look at a vast range of information, publications, etc., in order to really drill down deeply into our whole attitude towards child sexual exploitation, our whole history of what we understand it to be, and also where all the gaps might be. Now, they will look at, in a series of seminars, they're also going to have things like best practice from abroad. They're going to look at the victims' experiences. They're going to look at the criminal justice system and how it deals with victims and survivors. They're going to look at social and political narratives. And finally, they're also going to look at the health aspects and how the entire health service responded to both individual and collective victims and survivors of abuse. And as I said, the inspection reports will be scrutinised and researched, and the inspectorial organisations are going to be scrutinised themselves. So a very, very wide framework here. Now, I mentioned the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel. Most definitely, they made a presentation at this conference to very brave and interesting people who had been survivors of quite severe abuse themselves, but now the way that they were taking on their responsibilities, the way that they were seeing themselves as advisors, the way that they felt that they could be part of making a difference, part of making a change, I think was excellent. And also, to be fair too, they rebutted a lot of what they called misunderstandings in the media about arguments and disagreements and rows within the victims and survivors community. They felt that had been over-egged, over-exaggerated, and that now the inquiry had settled down and was working well together, and we were looking forward to their input, and they were looking forward to their input in a period of calm, as opposed to what could have been called a period of chaos, as the first year or so of the inquiry demonstrated quite a lot of public misgivings. So, what can we do? What can we, those of us that are involved in this work, as well as those of us that have got an interest in learning about this work, what can we do? Well, the inquiry is actually committed to having an outcome by, well, certainly substantially by 2020. But as I said, there will be interim reports published, the first of which I believe is in the spring of 2018. And people can get involved still. There will be helplines. There's a website which is www.iicsa.org.uk, which I'll put on the text side of the podcast. There's an information line, 0800 917 1000. There's an email, contact@iicsa.org.uk, and you can even write to them. But what I do suggest is that you trust them more. That's how I felt. I wasn't sure as to whether or not all the initial chaos in this inquiry had led to such a weakening of the structure and a weakening of the credibility that a lot of people would be finding it very difficult to come forward with any kind of true trust. But after that presentation in Manchester, I felt far more reassured. And just to remind ourselves that that's independent of government, it covers England and Wales either only, but that's quite big in itself. It's allowing victims and survivors to actually share their experiences, which is a first in the Truth Project. They're going to make regular feedback reports. They're going to ask for information from as wide a network as they possibly can, and that means you. And it's mainly to do with institutional abuse, yes, but it also can involve cases that were reported but people felt were never acted on properly. That can be looked into as well. So it's big, it's ambitious, it doesn't have an absolute finite date, although they've got some target times. And although they can't actually prosecute and convict people on a criminal basis, they can't get involved with compensation, it still has a very substantive remit in terms of both credibility, responsibility, and in terms of the power of the outcomes that they make. So I'm going to constantly give you an update on this, but it's going to last for quite some time, and I think the good thing to do now would be to get some guests on who are actually participating on the staffing side of the inquiry and actually take regular updates from them. So for now, thank you very much indeed for listening, as usual. Thank you to AlbaDigitalMedia for the technical support in making this podcast. And please keep coming back with these ideas, feedback and thoughts about the podcast, because it's yours as much as mine. And although I greatly enjoy doing it, I'm always wide open to suggestions as to how we can actually improve things. Maybe this magazine format is it. Anyway, until the next time, thanks for listening.